I planned on doing this in just 3 episodes, but getting to the carcass assembly point took so much effort that the third's really just going to take us to this point, because there's a lot of steps, and I wrestled with the idea of either omitting them because a lot of them are implied, but I figured, hey, it's free, so include them. The fourth will then include getting the tops permanently attached, the corbels made, and the fine-tuning and finishing. But right now, what you see coming up are the steps to get them to fully glued up state. Hope you enjoy. All right, before we assemble the lattice internal parts for the sides, I've laid them out and attempted to color match them as best I can. This set here will be the set where I've got a few of the bloomish pieces. I've got some wormholes, a couple of edge of burl and whatnot. These are the absolutely really clean pieces. These will probably go in the one that's destined to leave. But the next step is to sand them up and start gluing up the sub-assemblies. My order of assembly for basically any piece is if it's really rough, plane it. Next step is cabinet scraper. Next step is card scraper, and then light sanding. I absolutely hate power sanders. Make dust goes everywhere. So all of the little lattice pieces and all of the rails need a good scraping and sanding, and that should take us to being able to glue them up and not have to touch them once they're commingled with other things. Have to do the rails. If you use white oak, the wood's beautiful, but God, it's difficult, it's tight, it's hard as a rock. Tear out is all over the place, and unfortunately the card scraper here is getting a little tired. Got to put a new edge on it. The glue up for the lattice work assembly is pretty straightforward. I've got blue tape on the sides that I've sorted as show sides, because as you can see, you got to handle them a lot. It's pretty easy to get them mixed up, and one of them may have a better side than, they may have sides that you want to show versus getting them twisted around, turned to the inside. So go ahead and mark everything for what is the outside, the pretty face. Get them glued up and solidly clamped, and then you'll see where I also clamp them down to the bench to keep them perfectly flat during the drying process. Even though you mill everything to be perfect, and you mill all of the mortises and tenons to be just right, you'll end up with a lip here or there, or a slightly raised edge. Easiest way to deal with that is just plane it off and press on. Again, once these get glued to the legs, it'll be really hard to work on them because they'll be tight against the other part. So it's a good time to get them really perfect right now. So all the tenons are cut to half-inch thickness, and we could measure and lay them out on the legs, but to get them perfectly lined up, it's a lot easier just to clamp it up, mark where the mortises need to go, and we'll use that to mark all of them because all of the lattice pieces are the same. We're going to use a half-inch mortising chisel, so we really only need one side to reference off of. Now there's one exception to that. If you look, the top tenon, we simply cut it the same, use the same cheat cut we did for all the other tenons, which means we're really going to have not a lot of material left here. So we're going to go ahead and back this down a half-inch and go ahead and just take a piece out of this tenon before we go to do the glue up. So in order to make the tenon or the mortise slot a little further away from the top of the leg, we're just going to create a little haunch in the tenon here. Pretty short work of it. The exact depth of it, as long as you get close, it's okay. A little bit of slop in the up and down movement is not going to really hurt. That's not the grain that's going to hold it perfect. But cut it off and pare it down and test fit it. So with the mortise locations marked, it's back to my loyal adversary, my ancient and tiny but mighty hollow chisel mortiser, which if you treat it right, it'll make a good cut. It's been long on my list to get a much larger one, but this one works, and it's paid for, and not only that, it's there. So just like with the other mortises in the side rails, just take the time and work through them. So you can see here, unfortunately, on the inner side of the leg, the wall for the leg that's left after cutting the mortise is pretty thin. That's partially by design. I want the inside of the case to be smooth, so there's nothing to grab or make it difficult to put books in and out. If I was to do it over again, I may have moved the tenon over and not made it symmetrical. But this works out, as you'll see in the glue up. It's a pretty secure joint as is. I had narrated this section, but apparently there's a copyrighted music playing in the background, so I've got to dub over it. I'm just measuring the tenon. It I think came out at 0.52. The mortise is 0.5, so we're going to trim it down a couple strokes with the plane, then use a chisel to work down to the shoulder, and it should be good to go. The legs get the same exact treatment, card scraper or cabinet scraper or plane, whatever is required, then a light sanding to get rid of any tear out or really squirrely grain left from milling or tool marks. Same process as always, go through it start to finish. Nothing else, you get your work out for the week. Once all the parts are finished scraped and finished sanded and a dry fit has been tested and the tenons adjusted to fit in the mortises correctly, the glue up's pretty straightforward. It's just the hardest part's really keeping the parts aligned so you can remember what's the front or the back, and ultimately it doesn't matter, you can get them mixed up. But get the glue spread, get them in, get them clamped up. So the next step is to cut the mortises for the arch and the dados for the fixed shelves. Fixed shelves are easy. Center of the rail, measure the thickness of the shelf, mark the dado location. The shelf will start with a 1/8 inch reveal, so there'll be a little setback. We're going to give it a 1/2 inch for a haunch. In other words, we'll do a stop dado that'll make a somewhat more attractive lip of the shelf. Then once we get the shelf laid out, we know exactly where the rail will go. The rail will ultimately want to be flush up against the shelf. To get that, we're going to give it another reveal, so it'll come in another 1/8 inch from the front lip of the shelf. So that puts it a 1/4 inch back. So here's our 1/4 inch line, and here's our total thickness line, which you can simply get by laying it out. From there, we mark in the inset distance for the shoulder of the tenon, which is easy to measure. Mark out where we've got to take it out. Now here I've got them laid face down, inside up, and front legs together. So if these were to come up like that, that's how the case would be. I almost forgot, there is one difference in the top arch location, which will go something like this. Because if you cut it as the lower arch, you would end up with a really thin wall here, which, since it's going to have a top on it, wouldn't be a big issue, but for safety's sake, much like we cut this tenon down, we'll cut the tenon here down a 1/2 inch. So it would normally stop here. We're going to take a 1/2 inch off of it, so we're making a slightly smaller mortise on the top, and when we pick the arches for the top, we'll go ahead and cut them down. So the arch mortises are cut exactly as all the others. Here we're still using the 1/2 inch chisel. Cut, move, vacuum, and the layout lines really help, so you know exactly where you need to be. But once you get that set up for the first piece, you can leave the mortiser set up, and that way all of the parts will be symmetrical. And for the top arch, we do have to relieve the same 1/2 inch in the tenon. And in this case, it's just a quick saw and pop off the excess, do a little paring to make it neat, and we're good to go. So I've laid out the arch using a flexible rod. In this case, it's just a piece of carbon, 1.5 inches up, and it doesn't start until probably 1/8 of an inch in from each side, just to make it look a little better. It doesn't just dive into the side of the case. I've stabilized it with a couple of pins so that when I trace it, it doesn't want to bow and move around on me. And once marked, it's just a matter of sawing as close as you can to the line, because this is the one you're going to hand pare to make your master, and you don't want to have to cut off a whole lot. But and I don't think anyone's ever going to lay your case down on its back and string a long line and check the accuracy of your arc. As long as it looks good, it's fine. Once you have the rough shape cut, a spoke shave would be a fantastic tool. I don't have one, of course, or I don't have a working one at this point, but I don't mind using a card scraper. I like to go downhill, so that way you're never going against the rough grain. So I'll go downhill on both sides, keep working it, and as soon as I get to a point where I've leveled out the bandsaw marks, and it's just a question of sanding it, and you have your master. With master made, you can go ahead and mark all the other 3 arches and simply cut them off, leaving a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch away from the line, because we'll trim that up with a flush trim bit. So double-sided tape and a flush trim bit and a router table, and you're good to go as far as making the other pieces match this one, so they're all identical even if they're not spot on perfect. And in this segment, unfortunately, you can see the dust hose down by my foot has come off. I don't really catch that until it's too late, but it's all right. Makes a big mess, but easy to clean up. Now the one side is great. You're going downhill and you're running with the grain, so there's very little chance to chip out. The other side, as you start to head up, you're basically going against the grain. You could fix that if you're really worried about it by flipping the piece over and retaping it so that you cut them both downhill. I did a test and it seemed reasonable, so I went ahead and risked it. You remember we marked dados for the fixed shelves. The best way to cut them is with a router, unless you have a router plane, hand plane, or some other way you want to do them. I love the work you can do with a router. I hate working with a router. They are noisy, messy, prone to run off in any other direction. But I use a simple jig, which is a zero clearance fence, and I clamp it directly to the line I want to cut to, and that allows me to generally cut these kinds of things. It's probably the most frequent use of a router that I have, which is cutting these either full dados or half-blind dados. In this case, the first one's easy. You can come in through the back and not do a climb cut. The second one, you've got to do a plunge cut. So you'll see me turn around here, and now I'm going to plunge in at the tip. My dog's barking. You could do a climb cut coming back. Did some of them that way. It doesn't run away from you if you keep a good handle on it. But for safety's sake, I generally don't do climb cuts. So I'll plunge in here and then go back the other direction with the fence on the other side. Leaves a bit of a jagged hole or edge at the end, easy to clean up, square up with the chisel. Now in some of these you're going to poke through into the mortise and tenon joint of the rail. It's not a big deal, it's all going to be covered. And also the exposed tip of the dado is going to be covered by the haunch of the shelf, so it's not super critical. The lead-up line is, because if you open that up too wide, you'll have a crack. But in this case, it's just a matter of chipping out the waste. And the last thing we really want to do that makes sawdust before we can glue up the main carcass is get our holes for the adjustable shelves drilled. I use this pretty inexpensive Craig shelf pin guide for the 5mm pins. It works fairly well as long as you don't let it move. So I move it from point to point with a clamp. And as long as you make both sides symmetrical, you don't need a ton of shelf holes, but enough to make them useful. All right, this is the glue up. I had the opportunity to film this twice, and unfortunately neither of them really give a good perspective on the process. I am 6'4", and so I use a very tall assembly table, which means there's really not a lot of room between it and the ceiling, so it's hard to get enough height and do it. But basically, what I found was really great. First off is a complete dry fit. All of the tenons needed a little bit of tweaking so that they could line up right after the dry fit. Then it's a matter of laying out all the pieces, and I get glue on one set, put them together, get glue on the second set, get them snapped into place. And it's hard to tell here, but I use some shop-made 90-degree jigs that are cut out of Baltic birch ply. And here I forgot to get that one jammed in, so I got to redo it, get it lined up right. And here comes the jig I was telling you about that really helped. I got to get the arch clamp in. Anybody knows a secret to getting F clamps to get in the right place with one hand, they should share it. All right, there's one of the 90-degree. There's that one, and then I'll put one over here. And I don't know that you can see it. Oh, nope. I guess I'll just show it in the next video. But really great 90-degree force clamp, so it really helps you square up carcasses and casework. And the last item for getting them to this state is go ahead and scrape and sand the tops. You can rip them to final width. I rip them to 1 inch larger or 1 inch wider than the Carcass, and I cross-cut them to 4 inches longer than the width of the Carcass, so I have a 2-inch overhang on each side. And fortunately, I did resharpen the card scraper, so now it's doing fantastic. All right, that's it for this episode. What's next will be making and fitting the adjustable shelves, putting the top on permanently with dowels, making and fitting the corbels, as well as staining and final finishing. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed.